What would you do if you saved up for 10 years, finally bought your dream cabin deep in the woods, and came back from a hardware run to find a strange woman literally drilling out your deadbolt? I thought I bought an isolated sanctuary. Instead, I accidentally bought the obsession of a tyrannical HOA president who decided my land belonged to her. This is the story of how a peaceful forest retreat turned into a total neighborhood war zone. Buying the Cedar Lodge at the edge of the Cascade Mountains was supposed to be the finish line of a grueling decade. I had spent my 20s and early 30s working 60-hour weeks at a logistics firm in Seattle, hoarding every spare dollar, skipping vacations, and driving a battered Honda Civic so I could finally escape the concrete jungle. When I saw the listing for a heavily wooded 5-acre property near North Bend, my heart skipped a beat. It featured a beautiful, albeit neglected, A-frame cabin built in the late 70s. It was entirely off the main highway, accessible only by a winding gravel road. Sarah Jenkins, my real estate agent, was the one who handed me the heavy brass keys after we closed escrow at Fidelity Title. She had been ecstatic for me, but she offered one small warning as we stood in the parking lot. "Destin, the property is an absolute gem," Sarah had said, adjusting her glasses. "But just be aware, the eastern border of your 5 acres runs right up against the perimeter of Pinecrest Estates. It's a massive, highly regulated, gated community. You are absolutely 100% not part of their homeowners association. The county records reflect that. But the people who run that neighborhood can be a bit territorial." I had laughed it off. I was separated from them by a dense thicket of old-growth pine trees and a natural creek. What could they possibly do? Complain about the leaves falling from my trees? I had no idea how prophetic Sarah's words would turn out to be. The first week was pure bliss. I spent my mornings drinking coffee on the wraparound deck, listening to the woodpeckers and the rush of the nearby stream. Why, the lodge smelled of aged cedar and damp earth. I started the exhausting but rewarding process of clearing out the overgrowth, fixing the cracked window panes, and scrubbing decades of grime from the hardwood floors. I felt untouchable. Then came Thursday. I was on my knees in the front yard, trying to pry a stubborn, rusted mailbox off its wooden post near the edge of the gravel road, when I heard the high-pitched whine of an electric motor. I stood up, wiping dirt from my forehead, and watched as a pristine, customized golf cart came rattling down my private dirt driveway. Driving it was a woman who looked like she had just stepped out of a country club catalog. She wore a pristine white tennis skirt, a pastel pink polo shirt, and a visor that shielded intensely calculating eyes. Her blonde hair was sprayed into an immovable helmet. She parked the cart right on my freshly raked gravel, stepped out, and approached me with a clipboard pressed firmly to her chest. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness that instantly sets your teeth on edge. "Are you the contractor hired to clean out the Miller property?" "I am Destin Miller," I replied, extending a slightly muddy hand. "I'm the new owner, just moved in last week." She did not take my hand. Instead, her eyes darted up and down my worn flannel shirt and stained jeans. Her smile tightened. "I see. Well, Destin, I am Beja Higgins, president of the Pinecrest Estates Property Owners Association. I'm here to drop off your welcome packet and issue a formal warning regarding the state of this yard." I blinked, genuinely confused. "Welcome packet? Beja, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This property isn't part of Pinecrest Estates. I bought this land independently. It's unincorporated county land." Beja let out a short, nasal laugh that sounded like a goose honking. She tapped a perfectly manicured acrylic fingernail against her clipboard. "Oh, a lot of the new buyers try that line. Look, Mr. Miller, your driveway connects to Oak Lane, which technically borders our south entrance. Furthermore, your roof shingles are not on the pre-approved color matrix, and that mailbox," she pointed a sharp finger at the rusted metal box I had been wrestling with, "is completely out of compliance. You have 14 days to submit an architectural review form for a replacement. If you don't, we will be forced to levy a daily fine of $50. I stared at her, trying to process the sheer audacity. Basia, I'm going to say this as politely as I can. I am not in your HOA. I did not sign a deed restriction. I do not pay you dues. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. Please leave my property. Her artificial smile vanished. The mask slipped, revealing a deeply furious, entitled woman underneath. We have an easement, she snapped, stepping closer, and we are in the process of a community boundary adjustment. We don't tolerate eyesores bringing down our property values, Destin. I suggest you read the packet. I will be back on Monday to check your progress. Without another word, she spun around, marched back to her golf cart, and sped off, the electric motor whining in protest. I picked up the thick manila envelope she had tossed onto the hood of my truck. It was filled with hundreds of pages of CC and Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I tossed it straight into the garbage can. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought she was just an overzealous neighbor who needed to be put in her place. I was dead wrong. The following week, I realized I was severely under-equipped for the renovations the lodge required. The plumbing in the guest bathroom was completely shot, and the kitchen needed an entirely new subfloor, which he died. On Wednesday morning, I locked up the cabin, got into my truck, and drove back down the mountain to Seattle. I planned to spend 3 days in the city, wrapping up the lease on my old apartment, grabbing the last of my furniture from a storage unit, and buying thousands of dollars worth of lumber, pipes, and tools from Home Depot. It was a chaotic, exhausting trip, but the thought of returning to my forest sanctuary kept me going. By Friday afternoon, the bed of my truck was loaded down with supplies, securely strapped and covered with a heavy tarp. The drive back up the mountain was spectacular. The late afternoon sun filtered through the giant Douglas firs, casting long golden shadows across the winding asphalt. I rolled the windows down, letting the crisp, pine-scented air flood the cab. The stress of the city melted away. I was finally going home. I turned off the main highway onto Oak Lane, hearing the familiar crunch of gravel under my tires. As I rounded the final bend that led to my secluded driveway, I hit the brakes so hard my truck fishtailed, the heavy load in the back shifting with a loud groan. There was a large white commercial van parked directly in front of my cabin. On the side, bold red letters read, "Gary's Mobile Lock and Key." Standing on my front porch, pointing at my heavy oak front door, was Basia Higgins. Beside her was a large man in blue coveralls, holding a heavy-duty Makita power drill. My blood ran cold, then immediately boiled over. I slammed the truck into park, didn't even bother taking the keys out of the ignition, and sprinted toward the porch. "Hey!" I roared, my voice echoing off the trees. "What the hell is going on here?" The locksmith jumped, pulling the drill back. A coil of brass shavings fell from my deadbolt to the wooden porch. Basia, however, didn't even flinch. She turned to look at me, her face a mask of smug satisfaction. She was holding a manila folder and a brand new set of shiny silver keys. "Ah, Mr. Miller," Basia said loudly, her voice projecting as if she were addressing a crowd rather than just me and a terrified contractor. "You're trespassing on association property. I strongly advise you to get back in your vehicle and leave before I call the authorities." I bounded up the steps, placing myself directly between the locksmith and my door. I looked at the man in the coveralls. His name tag read Gary. "Gary," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline, "if you put that drill back into my door, I am going to have you arrested for breaking and entering, and I will sue your company into the ground. Pack up your tools right now." Gary looked completely panicked. He looked from me to Basia, lowering the drill completely. "Lady, you told me this was an abandoned foreclosure owned by the HOA. You said you had the legal authority to rekey it for the bank." "I do," Basia shrieked, her composed facade cracking. She shoved the manila folder toward Gary. "Hey, this property is in gross violation of over 30 community bylaws. It has been abandoned for months. We have an emergency injunction to secure the premises to prevent further blight to Pinecrest Estates." "I bought this place 3 weeks ago," I yelled, pulling my phone from my pocket. I frantically scrolled through my emails until I found the digital copy of the deed sent by Sarah Jenkins. I shoved the glowing screen into Gary's face. "Look, Grantee Destin Miller, Legal description matches this address. This woman is a lunatic. She is the president of the HOA next door and has zero legal right to be on my land. Gary didn't need to read the fine print. The sheer panic in his eyes told me he realized he had just stepped onto a massive legal landmine. He scrambled backward, hurriedly tossing his drill and lock-picking kit into a metal toolbox. "I'm out of here," Gary muttered, not making eye contact with either of us. "I'm not getting involved in this. Lady, do not ever call my dispatch again." "Gary, you get back here. I am paying you," Beja yelled, but the locksmith was already jogging toward his van. He threw his tools in the back, slammed the doors, and drove off so fast he kicked up a cloud of dust and gravel that coated Beja's pristine tennis shoes. William, silence fell over the porch, broken only by the distant cawing of a crow. I turned slowly to face Beja. She was clutching her folder so tightly her knuckles were white, her face flushed with a furious, ugly red. "You are trespassing," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I want you off my property, now." "This isn't over," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You think you can just buy a piece of land and do whatever you want? You are a cancer to our property values." I have the board behind me. We have a legal fund. We will annex this property, foreclose on it for unpaid fines, and bulldoze this hideous shack to the ground. "Get out," I commanded. Beja glared at me for a venomous second before turning on her heel. She marched back to her golf cart, which was parked behind my truck. As she drove away, she purposefully steered the cart directly through a bed of wild ferns I had spent an hour trying to revive the week before, crushing them under the tires. I stood on the porch, my chest heaving, listening to the electric motor fade into the distance. I looked down at my front door. The deadbolt was completely ruined, the brass cord drilled out and mangled by Gary. I couldn't even lock my own house. The sanctuary I had poured my life savings into had just been violated, and a creeping realization began to set in. Beja Higgins wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She was dangerous, and she was actively trying to steal my home. I spent Friday night sleeping on the couch in the living room with a loaded hunting rifle resting against the coffee table. Every snapping twig, every rustle of the wind through the pines made my eyes snap open. I had wedged a heavy wooden chair under the front doorknob, but the lack of a functioning lock made me feel incredibly exposed. First thing Saturday morning, I called the local sheriff's department. It took 2 hours for a cruiser to finally navigate the winding dirt roads and pull into my driveway. Officer Lewis, a young deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stepped out, hitching up his duty belt. I showed him the drilled-out lock, my deed, and explained the entire saga with Beja Higgins and the locksmith. Officer Lewis took notes on a small pad, nodding slowly, but his expression remained painfully neutral. "Mr. Miller," Officer Lewis finally said, clicking his pen closed. "I understand you're frustrated, but without any direct threats of physical violence, and since she claimed she believed she had administrative authority via the HOA, this falls heavily into a civil matter." "A civil matter?" I echoed, my voice rising in disbelief. "She hired a locksmith to break into my house. She was trying to change the locks and steal my property. She didn't enter the residence, and she claims she made an administrative error based on community boundary disputes," Officer Lewis replied, adopting a bureaucratic tone. "I've dealt with Mrs. Higgins before. The Pinecrest Board is notoriously aggressive with property lines. I can go over there and tell her to stay off your land. But if you want her charged for the lock, you're going to have to take it to small claims court. My hands are tied." I wanted to scream. I thanked him through gritted teeth and watched him drive away. The law wasn't going to help me. I was entirely on my own. As I was standing in the driveway, staring at the dust settling behind the cruiser, I heard the crunch of heavy boots approaching from the woods opposite the Pinecrest boundary. I spun around, my nerves completely frayed, half expecting Beja to emerge with a bulldozer. Instead, an older man walked out of the tree line. He looked to be in his late 60s, wearing faded denim overalls, heavy work boots, and a battered canvas jacket. He had a thick, gray beard and piercing blue eyes that crinkled at the corners. He was carrying a walking stick carved from a thick branch of cedar. "Saw the county mountie drive off," the man said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "Let me guess. Basha Higgins?" I blinked, momentarily thrown off guard. "Yeah. How did you know?" The old man chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. He extended a calloused hand. "Agostino Hamilton. I own the 40 acres directly north of you. Been here since 1982. Welcome to the neighborhood, son. You've just met the Wicked Witch of Oakhaven." I shook his hand, feeling a sudden immense relief at finding an ally. "Destin Miller. She tried to have my locks changed yesterday while I was in the city." Agostino let out a low whistle, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "She's getting desperate. I heard she tried to pull the abandoned property stunt. She pulled that on a widow 2 miles down the road a few years back. Bullied the poor woman into selling her parcel for pennies on the dollar to the HOA. But why?" I asked, gesturing to my modest cabin and the wild overgrown yard. "I don't get it. My property is a mess compared to their manicured lawns. Why does she care so much about what I do over here? It's not even part of their community." Agostino's eyes darkened and he looked around the woods as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It ain't about your mailbox, Destin, and it sure as hell ain't about the paint color of your shingles. Let me show you something." Agostino gestured with his head, leading me around the back of my cabin. We walked past my overgrown patio, down a slight incline, until we reached the natural creek that formed the southern boundary of my property. The water ran crystal clear over smooth river stones, babbling quietly in the morning air. "You see this creek?" Agostino asked, pointing his stick at the water. "This feeds down from the high mountain snowmelt, but right under your property, right beneath where your cabin sits, is a massive natural artesian aquifer. Your deed includes full, unrestricted riparian and mineral rights to this land." I stared at him, not quite connecting the dots. "Okay, I have well water. That's pretty standard for off-grid cabins." "You have more than just well water," Agostino corrected. "Pinecrest Estates built a massive 18-hole championship golf course 3 years ago. It's the crown jewel of Basia's reign as president. But they miscalculated the water table. During the summer months, they don't have enough water to keep the greens alive. They've been secretly trucking in water at a massive deficit to the HOA budget. The board is millions in debt, and the residents are about to revolt over special assessments." My jaw slowly dropped as the pieces clicked into place. "Basia doesn't care about your mailbox," Agostino said grimly. "She needs your land. If the HOA can annex your parcel, they gain the legal rights to tap the aquifer. They can sink a commercial pump right in your front yard and siphon off millions of gallons of free water to save their bankrupt golf course. If they don't get your land, Pinecrest Estates is going to financially collapse within the year, and Basia will be investigated for embezzling the funds that got them into this mess." I stood frozen, staring at the bubbling creek. This wasn't a petty neighborhood dispute over lawn care. This was a calculated, desperate corporate land grab. Basia had banked on a naive city boy buying the property, someone she could easily intimidate with fake legal jargon and aggressive tactics, until I surrendered the deed. "She forged an annexation document," I murmured, remembering the paperwork she had shoved in my face during the confrontation with the locksmith. "She's trying to establish a paper trail showing my land belongs to the HOA." "Exactly," Agostino nodded. "And she owns half the local zoning board. That's why the sheriff won't touch it. It's a rigged game, Destin. She expects you to pack up and run." A slow, burning anger ignited in my chest. It was a different kind of anger than the panic I felt yesterday. It was a deep, resolute fury. I had bled for 10 years to buy this sanctuary. I had sacrificed my youth, my time and my energy to claim a small piece of the world for myself, and I wasn't about to let a corrupt, desperate tyrant steal it from me to water her putting greens. "I'm not running," I said, my voice steady and cold. Agostino smiled, a genuine, terrifying grin that revealed a row of slightly crooked teeth. "Good, because I've got the original 1970 plat maps in my barn, and I know a pit bull of a property lawyer in Seattle who loves tearing apart fraudulent HOAs. You want to go to war with Beja Higgins, son? Let's go to war. First thing Monday morning, Agostino and I drove my truck down the mountain and into downtown Seattle to meet his pit bull. Richard Caldwell operated out of a sleek, minimalist office overlooking the Puget Sound. He was a sharply dressed man in his 50s with the intense, unblinking stare of a predatory bird. I laid out the original 1970 plat maps, my spotless deed, the fake annexation paperwork Basha had shoved in my face, and high-resolution photos of my drilled-out deadbolt. Richard examined the documents in total silence for 20 minutes. The only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When he finally looked up, he didn't look sympathetic or angry. He looked downright hungry. Slander of title, tortious interference, trespassing, destruction of private property, and blatant, documentable fraud. Richard listed off, ticking the offenses on his fingers. He tapped Basia's annexation document with a gold fountain pen. This paperwork is completely fabricated, but it gets worse, Destin. While you were driving here this morning, I pulled the county records on your parcel. Beja Higgins filed a lien against your property last Friday afternoon for unpaid community assessments and architectural violations to the tune of $45,000. I felt the blood drain from my face, and my stomach dropped into my shoes. 45,000. How is that even possible? I've only owned the place for a few weeks. I don't even have a mortgage. I paid cash. That's exactly why she targeted you, Richard explained, leaning back in his leather chair. She assumed you were a wealthy, hands-off buyer from the city who would be terrified of a massive lien clouding your title. Most people in your position would settle, pay the fines, or sell the property cheap just to make the headache go away. By filing that lien, she has legally encumbered your land. If you tried to sell it tomorrow, the HOA would get paid first. It's a classic, aggressive land grab tactic used by corrupt boards. Agostino grunted from the corner of the office, leaning on his cedar walking stick. I told you, Destin, it's the aquifer. That golf course is sucking Pinecrest dry, and they need your water rights to avoid bankruptcy. Agostino is right, Richard agreed, his eyes gleaming. And we are going to make them bleed for this. I am drafting an emergency injunction to remove the fraudulent lien, and we are filing a massive countersuit for damages, harassment, and fraud. But listen to me carefully, Destin. Desperate people do desperate things. As soon as she gets served with these papers, she is going to realize her intimidation tactics failed. She will escalate. You need to secure your perimeter. I took Richard's advice to heart. On the way back up the mountain, I maxed out my remaining credit card on an intricate, top-of-the-line wireless security system. I bought 8 4K night vision trail cameras, motion-activated floodlights, and a reinforced steel security door. When I finally turned onto Oak Lane and approached my property, my heart rate spiked. There, blocking the entire width of my gravel driveway, was a massive, bright orange backhoe. Behind it, a crew of laborers was actively digging a 3-foot-deep trench straight across the entrance to my land. A temporary chain-link fence had been hastily erected behind the trench, effectively landlocking my truck, and standing on the other side of the fence, arms crossed and looking thoroughly triumphant, was Beja Higgins. I slammed the truck into park, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and stepped out into the afternoon sun. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" I yelled over the roar of the backhoe's diesel engine. Beja smiled, adjusting her visor. "Oh, hello, Destin. We are simply performing emergency utility maintenance. The Homeowners Association has voted to upgrade the fiber optic network for the community. Unfortunately, the main conduit runs directly beneath this easement." "There is no easement here," I shouted back, pointing the camera directly at her face. "This is private property. You are cutting off access to my home." "The community annexation process is well underway, Mr. Miller," Beja retorted, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "I'm afraid this road will be closed for the next 3 to 4 weeks while we complete the digging. I suggest you find alternative accommodations, perhaps a hotel back in the city. After all, living in a construction zone with no vehicular access is hardly sanitary." She was trying to starve me out. She knew I couldn't haul lumber, plumbing supplies or groceries through the dense woods on foot. If I left, she would have total control of the site to tap the aquifer. "You have 24 hours to fill that trench and remove this equipment, Beja," I warned her, fighting to keep my voice steady. "My lawyer will be serving you tomorrow morning." Beja let out her grating nasal laugh. "Lawyer? Oh, Destin, the HOA has a legal defense fund of over $200,000. We will bury you in paperwork until you are completely bankrupt. Have a lovely afternoon." She turned and marched away, signaling the backhoe operator to keep digging. I stood there, boiling with rage, staring at the impassable ditch. I had to park my truck half a mile away, on a public logging road, and hike through the thick brush, carrying my heavy boxes of security cameras through the mud. That night, my muscles burning from the grueling hike, I didn't sleep. I mounted the new steel door. I spent hours scaling the pine trees around my property line, hiding the camouflage trail cameras in the high branches, angling them perfectly to cover the road, the creek, and the perimeter of my cabin. I was preparing for a siege. The next morning, right on schedule, a process server handed Beja Higgins a thick stack of legal documents demanding the immediate lifting of the fraudulent lien and slapping the HOA with a $500,000 lawsuit. The war had officially gone nuclear. The lawsuit hit the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association like a bomb. By Wednesday afternoon, Agostino had gleefully informed me through our newly established walkie-talkie channel that the neighborhood was in total chaos. Beja had been forced to hold an emergency board meeting. Residents were reportedly screaming at her about the lawsuit, demanding to know why their HOA dues were being used to fund a vendetta against a non-resident. But Beja was a cornered animal, and instead of surrendering, she doubled down. She refused to fill the trench, blocking my driveway, claiming the legal injunction didn't apply to pre-existing infrastructure projects. I was entirely trapped on my own land, relying on Agostino to hike over with supplies. "She's running out of time, Destin," Agostino told me over a crackling radio signal on Thursday evening. "The county judge fast-tracked your injunction hearing for next Tuesday. Once the judge sees the fake annexation papers, Beja is going to be facing criminal fraud charges. If she's going to make a move on your water, it has to be now. She needs to destroy your well to prove to the board that your land is worthless and secure her authority." Agostino's words echoed in my mind as I sat on my dark porch, a heavy flashlight in one hand and the control monitor for my security cameras in the other. I had anticipated her targeting the water supply. But what Beja didn't know was that the rustic wooden pump house visible from the property line, the one that looked like a traditional wellhead, was completely fake. When I bought the lodge, I discovered the previous owner had relocated the actual artesian well pump to a heavily reinforced subterranean vault directly beneath the back deck to prevent pipes from freezing in the winter. The old pump house in the yard was nothing but an empty wooden shed covering a dry, collapsed pipe from the 1970s. If Beja wanted to poison my well or destroy the pump to ruin the land's value, I was going to let her try. I had wired 2 hidden cameras directly inside the fake shed. Friday night arrived, bringing with it a thick, rolling mountain fog that swallowed the moonlight. The forest was dead silent, save for the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the pine needles. I sat in my living room, the lights completely off, sipping cold coffee and staring at the glowing matrix of 8 camera feeds on my iPad. At 1:15 a.m., the motion alert on camera 3 flashed red. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tapped the feed, expanding it to full screen. The infrared night vision cast an eerie, glowing green tint over the footage. 3 figures were emerging from the woods on the Pinecrest side of the property line. They were moving swiftly, carefully stepping over the ferns, holding flashlights covered with red cellophane to minimize the beam. As they crept closer, the camera's high definition caught their faces. Leading the pack was Beja Higgins, wearing a dark tracksuit, her blonde helmet of hair tucked under a black beanie. Behind her were 2 men I recognized instantly, the backhoe operator from earlier in the week, and another member of the HOA board I had seen yelling at the process server on Agostino's recorded video. They were carrying heavy, 5-gallon plastic buckets and a massive pair of bolt cutters. I hit the record button on the main DVR interface, my hands shaking, with a mix of fear and absolute vindication. "Got you," I whispered into the dark room. I watched on the screen as Baisha directed the two men toward the fake wooden pump house in the center of the yard. She pointed aggressively at the heavy padlock I had placed on the shed door just that morning to make it look authentic. The backhoe operator stepped forward, raised the bolt cutters, and snapped the lock with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet valley. They pulled the wooden doors open and stepped inside the shed. I immediately switched my iPad to camera 7, the hidden feed wired into the rafters of the fake pump house. The audio feed kicked in, picking up their hushed, frantic whispers. "Hurry up," Basia hissed, shining her red flashlight onto the rusted, useless pipe protruding from the dirt. "Pour the concrete mix down the casing. Once it sets, the aquifer tap is permanently blocked. We'll tell the judge his well was already dry and collapsed, making the property a severe fire hazard. The county will condemn it, and we can annex the land at auction for pennies." "Are you sure about this, Basia?" the board member whispered nervously, prying the lid off one of the heavy buckets. "If we get caught dumping quick-set concrete into a natural water table, the EPA will send us to federal prison." "Shut up and pour it, Carl," Basia snapped, her voice trembling with manic desperation. "If we don't fix the golf course water deficit by the end of the month, the auditors are going to find the missing funds. Pour it now." I didn't wait another second. I grabbed a powerful 1,000 lumen tactical flashlight and my heavy wooden baseball bat, unlocked my reinforced front door, and sprinted silently across the damp grass. I crept up right behind the open doors of the shed. I could hear the heavy, wet slop of concrete mix being prepared in the buckets. I took a deep breath, raised my flashlight, and stepped directly into the doorway. I hit the switch. A blindingly intense beam of white light flooded the small shed, illuminating the three of them like deer caught in headlights. "What a fascinating HOA meeting," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. "Is this a new community landscaping initiative, Basia?" Carl screamed, dropping a bucket of dry concrete mix directly onto Basia's foot. A cloud of gray dust erupted into the air, causing them to cough and stumble backward over each other in the confined space. "You're trespassing," Basia shrieked, blindly waving her hands in front of her face to block the blinding light. "Turn that off." "Actually, you're trespassing," I corrected, keeping the beam locked on her face. "And you're on 8 different 4K cameras with audio. I just recorded you conspiring to illegally destroy a natural aquifer, commit federal environmental sabotage, and confessing to embezzling HOA funds." The backhoe operator didn't hesitate. He dropped his tools, shoved Carl out of the way, and bolted out of the shed, sprinting blindly into the dark west and leaving his boss behind. Basia froze, the concrete dust settling on her black tracksuit. The horrific realization of what had just happened washed over her features, draining the furious red from her face and leaving her a pale, ghostly white. She looked down at the useless pipe, then back up at me. "That's a dry pipe from 1974, Basia," I smiled, stepping aside to reveal the flashing blue and red lights of a sheriff's cruiser, finally pulling up to the barricade at the end of my driveway. Agostino had made the call the second the motion alarms went off. "The real well," I told her softly, "is right under my house, and you are going to prison." Officer Lewis was not alone this time. As the flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding forest in chaotic strobes, 2 heavy-set deputies and a senior sergeant marched past the trench, their heavy boots crunching loudly on the gravel. They had been waiting at the barricade for Agostino's signal. Basia's bravado completely evaporated. She dropped the flashlight, her hands trembling violently as she tried to brush the dry concrete dust from her expensive tracksuit. Carl, the terrified board member, had already sunk to his knees in the damp grass, openly weeping and muttering apologies to no one in particular. "Officers!" Basia gasped, her voice pitching up in an octave into a frantic, breathless squeak. She stepped out of the fake pump house, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "Thank God you are here. This man lured us onto his property. He is unstable. We were simply conducting a routine midnight safety inspection because of the fire hazards. and he attacked us with a weapon. She gestured dramatically toward the wooden baseball bat hanging loosely by my side. The senior sergeant, a tall man with a salt and pepper mustache, whose name tag read Harrison, didn't even blink. He looked at the shattered padlock on the ground, the heavy bolt cutters lying in the dirt, and the open buckets of quickset concrete mix. "A safety inspection," Sergeant Harrison repeated slowly, his voice dripping with heavy skepticism. "At 1:30 in the morning, with bolt cutters and concrete." "It's an administrative matter," Baisha insisted, taking a step toward the officers, trying to summon her usual authoritative sneer. "I am the president of Pinecrest Estates. I have legal easement rights to secure abandoned infrastructure." "Save it, Baisha," I interrupted, stepping forward and handing my iPad directly to Sergeant Harrison. "I have the entire thing on 8 different high-definition cameras. The video includes crystal-clear audio of her conspiring to pour concrete into what she believed was a live artesian well and confessing to embezzling funds from the Homeowners Association to cover up a golf course deficit." Baisha's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The color drained from her face so rapidly I thought she might actually faint. Sergeant Harrison tapped the screen, rewinding the footage. The crisp audio of Baisha's manic whispers echoed out of the iPad speaker into the quiet night. "Pour the concrete mix down the casing. If we don't fix the golf course water deficit by the end of the month, the auditors are going to find the missing funds." The silence that followed was absolute. "Well," Sergeant Harrison sighed, handing the tablet back to me. He unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. "That is a textbook confession to a multitude of felonies, including attempted environmental terrorism, breaking and entering, and vandalism." "Baisha Higgins, turn around and place your hands behind your back." "You can't do this," she shrieked, violently pulling her arm away as Deputy Lewis moved in to assist. "I am an upstanding citizen. This is a gated community. You work for us." "Actually, ma'am, I work for the county," Sergeant Harrison replied flatly. He grabbed her wrist, swiftly spinning her around and snapping the steel cuffs shut. The sound of the ratcheting metal was the sweetest music I had ever heard. "And you have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." They hauled Baisha, still kicking and screaming about her legal defense fund and property values, toward the cruiser parked at the end of the driveway. They scooped up Carl, who was completely compliant and blubbering about how Baisha forced him to do it, and placed him in the back of the second patrol car. The backhoe operator was apprehended by a K9 unit 3 hours later, shivering in a drainage ditch 2 miles down the highway. The weekend that followed was an absolute whirlwind of legal violence, orchestrated masterfully by Richard Caldwell. First thing Monday morning, Richard didn't just file the lawsuit, he went scorched earth. Armed with the police report and the video confession, he contacted the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the State Water Commission. Attempting to poison or permanently cement a natural water table that feeds into state rivers is a severe federal offense. By Tuesday, Pinecrest Estates was crawling with federal agents, state auditors, and local police. Richard subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, freezing all of their accounts. Agostino and I sat in Richard's downtown Seattle office on Wednesday afternoon, drinking scotch as the lawyer gleefully read the preliminary findings from the forensic accountant he had hired to tear through Pinecrest's books. "It's a complete house of cards, Destin," Richard laughed, tossing a thick dossier onto his glass desk. Baisha wasn't just hiding a water deficit for the golf course. She was actively bleeding the community dry. Here is what the auditors found in just 48 hours. The Shell Company. Baisha had set up a fake landscaping consultancy firm under her maiden name. The embezzlement. Over the past 4 years, she had funneled over $300,000 of HOA reserve funds into this shell company, masking the transfers as premium fertilizer and soil consultations. The desperation. When the golf course actually started failing due to the water shortage, the board demanded an audit of the landscaping budget. Panicking, Baisha realized that if the course died, they would look at the books and find the missing money. She needed your water to keep the grass green and the auditors away. She was facing complete financial ruin and a lengthy prison sentence. Agostino grunted, sipping his scotch. No wonder she lost her mind and came after your land. You were the only thing standing between her and a concrete cell. That Friday, the residents of Pinecrest Estates held an emergency, impromptu town hall meeting at their opulent country club. Agostino, who technically owned land bordering the community and had a few friends inside, managed to sneak me into the back of the auditorium. It was absolute bedlam. Over 300 wealthy, furious homeowners were screaming at the remaining board members. The revelation that their reserve funds were completely wiped out, that their property values were plummeting due to an impending federal investigation, and that their president was currently sitting in the county jail on a $500,000 bail, had sparked a full-blown rebellion. We are issuing a special assessment of $10,000 per household to cover the legal fees and the immediate bankruptcy threat. The interim president, a sweaty man in a golf shirt, yelled into the microphone over the deafening boos. "You aren't getting another dime from us," a woman in the front row screamed back. "We are dissolving this board immediately." I watched from the shadows near the exit, feeling a profound sense of closure. The tyrannical empire Basia had built on intimidation, fake fines, and stolen money was burning to the ground. She had tried to steal my sanctuary, but in the end, her arrogance had destroyed her own. The fallout from the midnight concrete raid, as the local papers dubbed it, was swift and merciless. Faced with massive federal charges, overwhelming video evidence, and a complete lack of funds, the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association capitulated on every single front. Richard Caldwell didn't even have to take them to trial. He utterly dismantled them in the settlement negotiations. The terms we dictated were absolute. Immediate dismissal of liens. The fraudulent $45,000 lien on my property was instantly removed, restoring my clean title. Financial compensation. The HOA was forced to pay out a settlement of $150,000 for harassment, trespassing, destruction of property, and emotional distress, heavily funded by the liquidation of the golf course's assets. The boundary wall. At their own expense, the HOA was ordered to fill the trench, blocking my driveway, repave the damaged gravel, and construct a highly aesthetic, 8-foot-tall, natural stone retaining wall along the entire eastern border, permanently separating my land from their jurisdiction. Beja Higgins did not fare as well. Her expensive lawyers abandoned her when they realized the HOA could no longer foot the bill. Cornered and facing a decade behind bars, she accepted a brutal plea deal. She pled guilty to felony embezzlement, federal environmental tampering, and fraud. She was sentenced to 4.5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the community she had robbed. Carl, the weeping board member, turned state's evidence against her and received 2 years of probation and a lifetime ban from holding any community administrative position. 3 months after the terrifying night in the shed, I finally found the peace I had spent 10 years working for. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in early October. The leaves on the maple and oak trees had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, carpeting the forest floor in color. I stood on my newly rebuilt front porch, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, breathing in the sharp, cold mountain air. My property was entirely transformed. The ridiculous rusted mailbox that had started this entire war had been replaced with a sturdy, custom-welded steel box. The driveway was perfectly leveled, and towering along the eastern edge of the woods was the beautiful, impenetrable stone wall that the HOA had been legally forced to build. It looked like a medieval fortress line, keeping the chaos of the outside world firmly at bay. The heavy oak front door of my cabin had been completely restored, featuring a high-security, reinforced steel deadbolt that no locksmith was ever going to drill out again. I heard the familiar crunch of heavy boots on the gravel and smiled. Agostino walked up the driveway, his trusty cedar walking stick in hand, a large foil-wrapped package tucked under his arm. "Morning, Destin," Agostino rumbled, tipping his faded canvas hat. "Thought you might need some provisions for the winter. venison sausage, cured it myself in the barn. Agostino, you are a lifesaver, I laughed, taking the heavy package. Come on up, I just brewed a fresh pot. We sat on the wraparound deck, looking out over the babbling creek that hid the massive, life-giving aquifer beneath us. The silence was profound, broken only by the chatter of a few blue jays and the distant rush of the wind through the pines. There were no electric golf carts whining in the distance. There were no clipboards, no fake fines, no tyrannical presidents trying to steal the earth out from under me. They filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy yesterday, Agostino noted casually, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Pinecrest, I mean. The golf course is completely dead, brown as a paper bag. Word is, a developer from Seattle is going to buy the land cheap and turn it into a public nature preserve. I leaned back in my cedar rocking chair, a deep, settling warmth spreading through my chest. A nature preserve, I think I can live with that. You fought the devil and won, son, Agostino smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the edges. You earned this peace. Enjoy it. And I did. Every single day. I spent my weekends finishing the renovations on the lodge, replacing the subfloors, updating the plumbing, and finally chopping enough firewood to last through the harsh mountain winter when the first heavy snow fell in December, blanketing the forest in pristine white. I sat by the roaring fireplace, entirely safe, entirely secure, and entirely alone. I had bought an empty forest lodge to escape the world. A corrupt, entitled tyrant had tried to turn it into a nightmare. But in the end, she only succeeded in paying for the beautiful stone wall that guarantees I will never be bothered again. If you enjoyed this insane story of beating a corrupt HOA at their own game, hit that like button right now. Stories like this prove that standing your ground and knowing your rights can absolutely destroy entitled tyrants. Don't forget to share this video with anyone dealing with a nightmare neighbor, and click subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss out on the craziest, most satisfying revenge stories on the internet. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done if Beja Higgins showed up at your door? See you in the next one.